Thanks very much, Wesley. We're going to take some questions now, so repeat it for the mic.
Yeah, sure. I'll just repeat the questions so that the microphone gets them. I use the word gay or lesbian, and I even used it a couple of times for myself. Why do I do that? And is that something that evangelical Christians should do? I think that my way of approaching this is somewhat pragmatic. In my ministry circles, a lot of people simply use these words. They're just in the culture in America. And I think part of what I want to do as a Christian is meet people where they are, sort of use the vocabulary that's current in the culture. And so part of it is simply strategic in terms of evangelism and ministry. I want to not have a kind of esoteric Christian vocabulary that prevents me from connecting with people. So if someone says to me, oh, you're describing yourself as attracted to men and experiencing that, does that mean you're gay? I will almost always answer that question yes, because I don't want to set up a barrier to further conversation. And then that opens the door to talk about why I am not married to a man, why I'm not sexually active, why I'm celibate. And then I can begin to describe the Christian story. So I think it's important to me, I said this in my Washington Waiting book, it's important to me to think of gay as one of the adjectives that Christians can use, but it's not a noun. In other words, it's not central to my identity. It doesn't define me. I don't think it will be true of me in the resurrection. I think same-sex attraction is a result of the fall. I think it's something that I experience because I'm born into a fallen world. And the way that our culture is describing that now is with the word gay. I don't imagine that word will actually be used in 50 years, that we'll be calling it something else. But for now, that's sort of the cultural vocabulary, and I'm happy to just use it as a kind of strategic choice. And there's more I could say about that, but that's the kind of basic answer. That's right. Yeah, Mark Yarhouse. Sorry. I need to repeat the question. Yeah, so the question was, is it helpful to distinguish between orientation, practice, and identity? And I think the answer is yes. There's a psychologist in the U.S. named Mark Yarhouse who's written a helpful book called Homosexuality and the Christian. And Yarhouse is a practicing psychologist. He has a ministry, and he will often ask his clients to sort of distinguish various things for the purposes of thinking more reflectively about themselves. And he will say, there's the attraction question. How strong are your same-sex attractions? Where on the spectrum would you place yourself? Are they only occasional? Are they more long-lasting? And then he says you have a choice about whether you're going to identify with a certain community then. You can say, well, I have these attractions, but I don't necessarily want to belong to gay culture or something like that. So he's distinguishing between your sexual orientation, your psychology, and then the public self that you are, the community that you belong to. And I think that's a really helpful way to think about it. You can use the word gay in multiple senses, and there may be a sense in which a Christian would say, my steady disposition is to be attracted to the same sex, and I'm calling myself gay in that sense, but I'm not gay in the sense that I'm not building my whole life around who I sleep with and what sort of patterns of community I belong to. So I think that is a helpful way to think about it. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, what should we do in a ministry context, in a church context, where we're counseling people or evangelizing people who are already in a committed same-sex partnership, already in a same-sex marriage or something like that? How would we approach that issue? And on the one hand, I'm sort of reluctant to answer that because I'm actually not ordained myself and not in kind of active pastoral ministry. But on the other hand, I can share what my instincts are in that. I think that it's probably unwise to give a sort of one-size-fits-all answer. I think that there are different circumstances that same-sex couples find themselves in. I mean, I can imagine one sort of couple who have spent the last 10 years reading all the progressive liberal arguments in favor of Christian same-sex marriage, and they're sort of coming to your church already with a very firm conviction in place that this is blessed by God. And I think your pastoral strategy with that sort of person is going to look very different than with the couple who've just come to faith. They actually don't know much at all about what Christianity says about sex or being made male and female or marriage, and so you're actually laying a lot of foundation there. So I think we need to be sensitive enough to know that not all same-sex couples are going to be wrestling with the same set of questions. One thing that has really helped me on this question is from the writer Eve Tushnet. And that's a name I would really recommend to you. She's a Roman Catholic woman who came out as a lesbian when she was in her teen years. Her last name, by the way, is Tushnet, Tushnet, Eve Tushnet. But she became a Christian in her university years, and she's now written about her own celibacy and her own commitment to Christ. And one of the things that she says that has really helped me is that a sexually active gay couple, those two people may well be called by God to be in one another's lives and to love one another. And in fact, what they are asked to unlearn as they commit themselves to Christian discipleship is their particular way of misinterpreting that call. In other words, they think that their call to love one another is to be expressed in sex, to be a sexually active relationship, when in fact, God does want them in each other's lives. They are part of one another's calling, part of one another's vocation, but God wants them loving each other chastely, without sex. And so I could imagine a pastoral situation where you're actually not going to counsel them to simply never see one another again, cut off the relationship, but you're going to counsel them to seek to remain in one another's lives in chastity. And, then that opens the question of, well, what do the boundaries look like? And again, I think that I'm reluctant to give a kind of one-size-fits-all answer to that. I think that could look 100 different ways depending on the particular couple. So I hope that helps at least a bit. Yeah, I think those. Sorry, I need to repeat the question. Yes, I'll get it. Maybe the next question. The question is, a lot of Christian presentations around this issue use a lot of the social sciences and appeal to statistics and sort of patterns of suicide rates and things like this, and how helpful is that? I think that my own sense is that we are really well served in that area in the Christian world. I mean, I think of the research of Mark Yarhouse. I think of other, Thomas Schmidt wrote a book called Straight and Narrow, ? There have been a lot of social scientific approaches to this question, and it strikes me, this is why I wrote my book, it strikes me that what we're lacking is the more personal presentations in which someone gives a testimony of what it feels like and looks like to be a celibate person who experiences same-sex attraction, or what does it look like to be someone who is married to someone of the opposite sex while still experiencing same-sex attraction. And it seems to me that, this is why I do what I do, and it seems to me that we need more stories, because a lot of I'll put it this way, a lot of what people are asking when they are contemplating committing their lives to Christ, if they're gay or lesbian, is they're asking, what might it look like for me to live a fulfilled, joyful, flourishing life as a Christian? And I think that where we as a church have often failed those people is we have not really projected, well, this is what your life could look like. We've instead given a lot of statistics. We've given a lot of biblical exegesis, which is crucial and important. But I think we've paid too little attention to what might your story look like. Here's an example for you to try to imagine what your future could be in the church. And so that's what I'm trying to do in my ministry, and I think we're beginning to see more stories like that. Yeah, I mentioned in my talk the sense of shame I had as a teenager and not wanting to talk much about this. And the question is are there ways that we in our churches and in our ministries can work against that sense of shame, giving people space to talk about this? And I think several things come to mind there. One would simply be that I think we too often give the impression that this is in a category by itself. This is the worst of all possible temptations. This is the worst sin that you could commit. And I think even in very good evangelical churches, we often implicitly leave people with that sense. And so one of the things I think we can do is better contextualize the biblical teaching and say, even in a passage like Romans 1, this is a particular sin that's listed right along with a bunch of other sins that many Christians commit. And so we can sort of say that although we want the freedom to name this as sin and teach the biblical teaching, we don't want to unfairly single it out for special condemnation. That would be one thing. I think another thing is we have, at least in the evangelical churches in the U.S., we have so undervalued celibacy. We have so under-taught on it that if you find yourself as a teenager like I did, fearing that you can't get married, feeling that there's something about your sexuality that makes marriage unlikely for you, you have a sense of, I'm so abnormal, I'm so off the beaten track of Christian experience that I'm not even sure the church would want to talk about this. You know, a lot of the churches I have been part of, all the Sunday school offerings, the retreat offerings have to do with marriage and parenting and things like this. And we so rarely emphasize lifelong singleness. We talk about singleness as a temporary state on the way to marriage, but we don't often talk about celibacy as a Christian commitment. And I think that if we were to begin to do that more, my sense is that that would help with this issue of shame. It would be very easy for a teenager who knows him or herself to be, you know, having gay inclinations to feel like, oh, well, there's an alternative for me other than just the nuclear family. You know, there is such a thing as honor and appreciation for celibacy in this parish. And then maybe I'll just add one more thing. I think that we should not underestimate as ministers the power of really small gestures. I'll just give you an example from my life. I remember listening to a sermon, I think it was an audio recording of a sermon from John Piper, in which he was preaching on Romans 1. And there's that wonderful passage in Romans 1 where Paul says, you know, the gospel is for Greeks and barbarians, you know, it's for everyone. Right before Romans 1, 16 and 17 there, where it's the righteousness of God from faith for faith. He says it's for everyone. And I remember this sermon just sort of riffing on that. And he said, you know, the gospel is for everyone in this room, whether you're black or white, rich or poor, gay or straight. And he just sort of moved on. And that was all he said about the issue of sexuality. And I remember listening to that sermon and thinking, you know, that was such a small gesture. But what it did for me is it let me know that my particular sexuality, my particular temptation was on that pastor's mind. He thought enough about it ahead of time to include that in the sermon. And that was, I mean, that takes almost no effort on your part as a minister, but it can make a world of difference to the gay person who's there in the audience listening to that. So that would be what I would say. Yeah. So the issue of gay marriage in society, could I comment on that or talk about that? And I confess that I'm still trying, along with my fellow Christians in the U.S., to figure out what it's going to look like to bear witness to the biblical teaching about marriage in a changing society. And I don't have a lot of firm answers or convictions on this at this point. A couple of people that I know who are in the Anglican world in the U.S., Ephraim Radner and Christopher Seitz, they're both Orthodox Anglicans in the U.S. They've just written a document called the Marriage Pledge, and they're basically calling on faithful Christian ministers in the U.S. and Canada to refuse to sign marriage licenses that the state has. So in other words, they're calling for a kind of separation of the state has its view of marriage and the Christian church has a very different understanding of marriage. That is, you know, that's one option, I think, for Christian people. I myself feel conflicted about that. And the reason I feel conflicted about it is because we know in the Christian teaching that marriage is about displaying Christ's love for the church, but it's not just something for Christians. Marriage is a creational good. It's a created ordinance, and so therefore it's part of common grace. It's for all people, whether they're Christian or not. And so it seems to me that there's still something important about, you know, it's still good for people, even if they're not Christian, to have the quote-unquote biblical view of marriage defended and honored in society. So I'm sort of dancing around your question a bit. I think that there are ways that I feel uncomfortable with what Radner and Seitz are about, but there are ways that I think that perhaps they're recognizing that for purposes of religious liberty, you know, we're going to need some kind of protection as the church to continue to teach what we believe marriage is, while recognizing that the society is going to go a different way in the coming years. So that's just a kind of thumbnail sketch of how you might think about it.
Okay, we need to leave it there. Wesley, you've been brought out by Liberty Christian Ministries, which is founded by David Peterson, actually. David, did you want to say anything about the conference this Wednesday and coming Saturday? Well, in the email I sent to you about today, there's a link to register. If you want to go on Wednesday, if you don't have lectures, that you can't actually register anymore online, but you could turn up at the door. It's just at Annandale Anglican. You can get the details on the email I sent you, and there's also the conference this Saturday as well. Wesley, do you have a Pittsburgh Steelers jersey?
I do, actually.
Well, we've got another jersey for you. We've got a more college jersey for you.
Oh, great.
Which
Excellent.
probably not as common in Pennsylvania, but just as good. So you've got a choice of colour there, and the other one is for Aidan,
Great.
your colleague. And we'd like to pray for you.
That would be great.
So what are some things that you'd like prayer for? So one student's going to pray for you,
Great.
and then another student's going to pray for the seminary that you work at, Trinity.
Great. Thank you.
And then another student is going to pray for all of us as we minister to people struggling with same-sex attraction. So what are some prayer points for yourself?
Yeah, I would appreciate your prayers for discernment about how best to engage this issue. I've now got a second book coming out on this issue, but I also recognize that I don't want this to simply consume my ministry. You know, I'm a teacher of New Testament, and I think God's called me to write and speak about a variety of things. So I'm facing some difficult decisions about how much I can say on this issue. You know, I get a lot of speaking invitations on this, and I'm feeling a conviction that I need to sort of limit those, you know, and steward my time wisely. And you know, I definitely believe God's calling me to have a voice on this issue, but I also believe God's calling me to preach and teach about other things as well. So I would appreciate prayers for discernment in that area.
To pray for Wesley. Yeah, great. And then for Trinity.
Yeah, I think just pray for our ongoing life together. We're trying to serve the Anglican Communion with biblical Orthodox teaching, and we're sort of a small place. So just pray for the quality of our life as a community, and pray for the strengthening of our lectures and our ministry efforts. I think being at a place like Moore College, you probably know how to pray for those things. So
Okay.
thank you very much.
Who'd like to pray for Trinity, a sister college of ours? Yep, great. And then anything about as we minister to those struggling with same-sex attraction, to, as you would say, gay Christians?
Yeah. I would encourage us all to pray for the strengthening of relationships outside of marriage in the church. I think marriages are absolutely vital to Christian community, but so is friendship. So is, intentional Christian community. So are small groups of Christians who meet for Bible study and prayer. And I think sort of investing these things with intentionality and prayer is so important alongside marriage. So I've got this book coming out called Spiritual Friendship, and I hope that you'll join me in praying for the cause of spiritual friendship, for our friendships to flourish in the church.